Pastor Daniel emerged like thunder made flesh, his pastoral robe whipping behind him, his face contorted with a fury that seemed to burn the very air around him. Ada stood frozen on the threshold, clutching a single worn bag against her chest, tears streaming down her face in silent rivers. Behind her, her mother's screams tore through the afternoon heat, raw and animal, the sound of a heart being ripped in two. Neighbors began gathering along the dusty street, their whispers spreading like wildfire through the compound. Pastor Daniel's voice boomed across the yard, each word a hammer blow. "Get out, and don't you ever come back with that shame!" Ada took one trembling step backward, then another. Her lips moved as if to speak, but no sound emerged. The bag slipped slightly in her grip, and she caught it, hugging it tighter as if it were the only thing tethering her to earth. But what Ada carried inside her was not the shame her father believed it to be. What she carried was a secret so painful, so devastating, that speaking it aloud would shatter more than just her father's rage. It would shatter his entire world, and perhaps that's why she remained silent, even as he cast her into the storm. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Ada turned away from the only home she had ever known. Her mother's face appeared briefly at the window, pressed against the glass, mouth open in a soundless wail before Pastor Daniel yanked the curtain shut. The neighbors didn't move to help. They simply watched, their eyes filled with judgment and something else. Something that looked almost like fear. Why would a man of God exile his own daughter? Why did the entire neighborhood remain frozen in their doorways, unwilling to extend even a hand of comfort? And why couldn't Ada speak the truth, not even to save herself from the streets, not even to her own mother who would have moved heaven and earth to protect her? These questions hung in the hot air as Ada walked away, each step taking her further from everything she had ever known, each step carrying her toward a darkness she couldn't yet imagine. There was a time when Ada had believed the church was the safest place on earth. She had grown up within its walls, her earliest memories painted with hymns and candlelight, with the smell of old wood and her father's deep voice leading prayers that seemed to reach straight to heaven. She had been the girl who arranged the chairs just so, who swept the aisles until they gleamed, who sang in the choir with a voice so pure that visiting missionaries would stop mid-conversation just to listen. Pastor Daniel had been strict, yes, but wasn't that what fathers were supposed to be? He demanded excellence in all things, especially in matters of faith. The community respected him, loved him even. When he spoke, people leaned forward. When he prayed, grown men wept. He had built that church from nothing, had shepherded lost souls back to grace, had performed miracles of faith that people spoke about in hushed, reverent tones. Ada's mother, Grace, had been his perfect complement. Where he was fire, she was water. Where he commanded, she comforted. She had a way of looking at Ada that made her daughter feel seen, truly seen, in a way that few mothers managed. Grace had taught Ada to sew, to cook, to move through the world with dignity and purpose. She had taught her that a woman's strength was not in her voice, but in her resolve. Ada's life had been simple and predictable. She taught Sunday school to children who adored her. She helped organize church events. She studied her Bible every morning before dawn. She was, by all accounts, the model pastor's daughter, the kind of girl other parents pointed to when lecturing their own children about righteousness and obedience. But somewhere in those years, in the corridors of the church where shadows gathered, in the quiet moments when everyone else had gone home, cracks had formed. Ada had learned to flinch when doors closed too loudly. She had learned to avoid certain hallways, to time her movements so she wouldn't be alone in certain spaces. She had learned to make herself small, invisible, to slip through rooms like a ghost. There had been a figure always lurking at the edges of her awareness, a shadow that wore a smile in public and something else entirely when no one was watching. Ada never spoke of it, not to her mother, not to her friends, not even to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts. Some truths are too terrible to voice. Some truths, once spoken, can never be unspoken. The night everything fell apart began like any other. Ada had been in her room, studying scripture when she heard her father's heavy footsteps approaching. She looked up to find him standing in her doorway, his face already dark with suspicion. Her mother hovered behind him, wringing her hands. "Ada," Pastor Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Look at me." She met his eyes and saw something there that made her blood run cold. He stepped into her room, his gaze sweeping across her belongings until it landed on what he'd been searching for. A pregnancy test, still in its box, tucked hastily under her bed. She had bought it that morning, her hands shaking so badly the pharmacist had asked if she was all right. Pastor Daniel picked it up slowly, as if it might burn him. His hands began to tremble. When he looked at Ada again, his eyes were filled with something worse than anger. They were filled with disgust. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is," he said. Ada opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How could she tell him? How could she explain that the man he trusted, the assistant pastor who had served faithfully for years, had cornered her in the vestry 6 months ago? How could she describe the weight of his hand over her mouth, the terror that had frozen her limbs, the shame that had consumed her every moment since? Grace moved forward, her voice breaking. "Daniel, please, let her explain." "Explain?" His voice rose, shaking the walls. "There's nothing to explain. My daughter, my own daughter, has brought disgrace upon this house." "Father, please," Ada whispered, finding her voice at last. "If you would just listen." "Listen?" He laughed, a terrible sound. "Listen to what? To lies? To excuses?" He threw the box at her feet. "You have shamed me. You have shamed this family. You have shamed the church." "Daniel!" Grace grabbed his arm. "She's your daughter." He shook her off. "No daughter of mine will carry a cursed child in this house." The words echoed through the compound, through the walls, through the windows, out into the street where neighbors were already gathering. Ada felt something inside her break, something fundamental and irreparable. She looked at her father, at the man who had taught her about love and mercy and grace, and saw only a stranger consumed by his own pride. "Pack your things," he said coldly. "You have 10 minutes. Grace collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing. "Daniel, no. Please. Where will she go?" "That," he said, turning away, "is no longer my concern." Ada moved through her room like a sleepwalker, gathering what little she could fit into one bag. Her hands moved automatically, folding clothes, tucking away a few precious items. A photo of her mother. A small Bible her grandmother had given her. The necklace she'd worn at her baptism. Everything else, her entire life, would stay behind. When she emerged from her room, the compound was full of people. Church members, neighbors, curious onlookers, all drawn by the commotion. They parted as she walked through them, their faces a mixture of pity and judgment. No one spoke. No one moved to help. They simply watched as Pastor Daniel pointed toward the gate. "Go," he commanded, "and don't you dare come back." Ada looked at her mother one last time. Grace was being held back by 2 church elders, her face streaked with tears, her mouth forming words Ada couldn't hear over the roaring in her ears. Then Ada turned and walked through the gate, out into a world she had never navigated alone, carrying nothing but a bag and a secret that was eating her alive. Behind her, the gate slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her bones. The first night was the hardest. Ada wandered the streets until her feet bled, until exhaustion made her stumble. She found a covered market stall and curled up beneath it, using her bag as a pillow. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sounds of the city at night, by fear that made her heart race every time footsteps approached. She woke before dawn, stiff and aching, and began walking again. She had no plan, no destination. She simply moved, because standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant drowning. Days blurred together. She learned which markets threw away the least spoiled food. She learned which public spaces had bathrooms where she could wash. She learned to recognize the look in people's eyes when they saw her growing belly, the way they would cross the street to avoid her, as if poverty and shame were contagious. Sometimes, late at night when she allowed herself to think, she wondered if she should have told her father the truth. But she knew it wouldn't have mattered. Assistant Pastor Jonah was beloved, respected, trusted. He had been with the church for 15 years. He counseled married couples. He led youth ministry. Who would believe her word against his? And even if they did believe her, what then? The scandal would destroy everything her father had built. It would tear the congregation apart. It would ruin lives far beyond her own. So she remained silent, bearing the weight of shame for a sin that had never been hers to carry. 3 weeks after her exile, Grace found her. Ada was sitting outside a closed shop, trying to stay out of the rain, when she heard her mother's voice. "Ada, oh my baby." Grace fell to her knees beside her daughter, pulling her into an embrace that nearly broke Ada's resolve to stay strong. For long moments, they simply held each other, rocking slightly, both weeping. "Come home," Grace whispered. "Please, we'll figure this out." "Mama, you know I can't." "Your father, he's just angry. He'll calm down. He'll—" "Grace." Pastor Daniel's voice cut through the rain like a whip. He stood at the corner, his face thunderous. "Come here, now." Grace's arms tightened around Ada. "No, I won't leave her. If you stay with her, you're choosing to leave your marriage." The words hung in the air between them. Grace's breath caught, her body going rigid. Ada pulled back, looking into her mother's eyes. "Go, Mama," Ada said softly. "Please, I'll be okay." "Ada, no, I can't just go." Grace's face crumpled, but she stood. She pressed something into Ada's hand. Money, Ada realized. Not much, but something. Then Grace turned and walked back to her husband, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Pastor Daniel put his arm around her, guiding her away, but not before he looked back at Ada one last time. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or regret. Then it was gone, and so was he. The money lasted 2 weeks. Ada used it carefully, buying food, finding cheap places to sleep. But it ran out, as all things do, and she was back on the streets, back to the grinding reality of survival. Her belly grew, with it grew the whispers. Pregnant girls on the street attracted attention of the worst kind, men with hungry eyes, women with cruel words. Ada learned to keep her head down, to move quickly, to trust no one. One evening, a well-dressed man approached her at a bus stop. He smiled kindly, asked if she needed help. Something in his voice reminded her of the church elders, that same soothing tone meant to inspire trust. He offered her a place to stay, a hot meal, a chance to rest. Ada's hunger almost made her say yes. But then she saw the way his eyes traveled down her body, lingering in places that made her skin crawl. She recognized that look. She had seen it before, in a vestry, in the moments before her life had shattered. "No, thank you," she said, standing on shaking legs. "Come on now," he said, his smile widening. "I'm just trying to help." His hand reached for her arm. Ada ran. She ran through the darkening streets, her bag bouncing against her hip, her breath coming in gasps. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out, until she collapsed in an alley behind a row of closed shops. She stayed there all night, too terrified to move, certain he would find her. When dawn finally came, she was hollow with exhaustion and fear. The baby moved inside her, a small flutter that felt like both a blessing and a curse. How could she bring a child into this life? What kind of future could she offer? 2 months later, on a night when the sky split open with thunder and rain came down in sheets, Ada's water broke. She was huddled in an abandoned shed on the outskirts of town, a structure that barely qualified as shelter. The contractions came fast and brutal, stealing her breath, making her cry out into the storm. There was no one to help. No midwife, no mother, no comforting voice telling her she could do this. There was only Ada and the pain and the terrible knowledge that she might die here, alone, forgotten. The hours stretched into an eternity. She screamed into the thunder, her voice lost in the storm. She prayed, though she wasn't sure anyone was listening anymore. She pushed when her body demanded it, bore down with the last reserves of her strength. And then, impossibly, miraculously, there was a cry. Not her own. A baby's cry, thin and reedy, but achingly alive. Ada collapsed back against the wall, her hands shaking as she reached for the tiny, slippery bundle. A girl. She had a daughter. In the flashes of lightning, Ada could see her face, scrunched and red and absolutely perfect. "Hope," Ada whispered, the name coming to her unbidden. "Your name is Hope." She wrapped the baby in her only clean shirt, held her against her chest, and wept. Not from sadness, not from pain, but from something else entirely. Something that felt almost like joy. They stayed in that shed for 2 days. Ada was too weak to move, too exhausted to do anything but feed hope and sleep in fragments. She didn't know how they would survive. She didn't know where they would go. But for those 2 days, in that broken shelter, they were together. And somehow, that was enough. On the 3rd day, Miriam found them. Miriam was a seamstress who lived alone on the edge of town. She had been walking to market when she heard a baby crying from the shed. What she found made her heart break and her resolve harden in equal measure. "Child," Miriam said, kneeling beside Ada, "how long have you been here?" Ada could barely speak. "I don't know." "Can you walk?" "I don't think so." Miriam looked at Hope, at Ada, at the conditions they'd been surviving in. She made a decision that would change all their lives. "I'm taking you home," Miriam said, "and I don't want to hear any arguments about it." She half-carried, half-dragged Ada to her small house. She drew a warm bath, prepared food, made up the spare bed with clean sheets. She asked no questions, made no judgments. She simply provided what Ada had been denied for so long, safety. "Rest," Miriam said, placing Hope in Ada's arms. "Both of you. Rest." For the first time in months, Ada slept without fear. In the days that followed, as Ada regained her strength, Miriam watched her with quiet interest. She noticed how Ada would examine the curtains, running her fingers over the stitching, how she would study Miriam's sewing projects, asking thoughtful questions about technique and design. "You know your way around fabric," Miriam observed one afternoon. "My mother taught me," Ada said, "but I've never been very good." "That's because you've never had reason to be. Want to try something?" Miriam set her up with scrap fabric and basic supplies. Ada's first attempts were clumsy, her hands unpracticed. But something happened when she focused on the needle and thread. The world narrowed to just that moment, just that stitch. The shame, the fear, the grief, all of it faded into the background. She made a small pouch for Hope's things, then another. Then a carrier that could be worn across the chest. Miriam watched, saying nothing, but her eyes sparkled with recognition. "Make 10 of those carriers," Miriam said. "I know someone at the market who'll buy them." Ada looked up, uncertain. "You really think so?" "I know so." The carriers sold in 2 days. The merchant came back asking for more. Ada worked through the nights while Hope slept, her fingers flying across the fabric. She made bags for school children, carriers for mothers, small pouches for keeping precious items safe. Each piece was crafted with care, with attention to detail that spoke of something beyond mere skill. Each piece carried a small portion of her pain, transformed into something beautiful. Word spread. Women began coming to Miriam's house specifically to buy Ada's work. They admired the stitching, the durability, the thoughtful design. Some asked if she could teach them. Ada hesitated, but Miriam encouraged her. "Share what you know," Miriam said. "Lifting others doesn't diminish your own light." So Ada began teaching. A few women at first, then more. They would gather in Miriam's courtyard, sharing stories and laughter as they learned. For many of them, it was more than just sewing. It was community. It was purpose. It was a reminder that their hands could create, not just serve. Hope grew in this environment of quiet industry and female solidarity. She was passed from lap to lap, loved by every woman who walked through Miriam's gate. She heard their stories, absorbed their strength, learned that family was not always blood. Meanwhile, back at the church, the foundation of Pastor Daniel's world was beginning to crack. It started small. A young woman in the choir, barely 17, ran out of Sunday service in tears. She locked herself in the bathroom, refusing to come out, refusing to speak. When she finally emerged, her eyes were haunted, her hands shaking. Then another woman, one of the ushers, broke down during Wednesday prayer. She stood up in front of everyone and said, her voice raw with pain, "I can't keep silent anymore. I can't keep pretending." She told her story, how Assistant Pastor Jonah had cornered her in his office 2 years ago, how he had told her it was God's will, how she had been too terrified to speak. The sanctuary went silent. Then another woman stood, and another, each with their own story, their own wounds. 5 women in total, spanning years, all victimized by the man Pastor Daniel had trusted, had elevated, had defended. Jonah was arrested that night. The police came during evening service, led him away in handcuffs while the congregation watched in shock. Pastor Daniel stood frozen at the pulpit, his face gray, his hands gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles went white. In the days that followed, the whispers began. People remembered Ada's sudden departure. They remembered her growing belly, her desperate eyes, her silence. They remembered how quickly Pastor Daniel had cast her out, how absolutely certain he had been of her guilt. They began to ask questions. Wasn't Ada pregnant when she left? You don't think, how old was she? 19? 20? Where is she now? Grace heard the whispers. Each one was a knife in her heart, because she knew. Deep in her soul, she had always known that Ada had been telling the truth in her silence. She had seen the fear in her daughter's eyes, the way she had flinched from Jonah's rare visits to their home. She had ignored the signs because acknowledging them would have meant facing an unbearable truth. Pastor Daniel heard the whispers too. They haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying that final confrontation with Ada. He remembered how she had opened her mouth to speak, how the words had died on her lips. He remembered the pleading in Grace's voice. He remembered his own rage, his own certainty, his own pride. He had been so sure, so absolutely convinced of his righteous judgment. And he had been catastrophically wrong. He tried to find Ada. He asked everyone he could think of, searched the streets, visited shelters. But Ada had disappeared. No one seemed to know where she had gone. Or if they did, they weren't telling him. Perhaps they thought she was better off wherever she was. Perhaps they were right. Grace begged him to keep trying. She's our daughter, Daniel, our only child. I know, he said, his voice cracking. God help me, I know. He sent messages through every channel he could think of. He left notes at places Ada used to visit. He offered money as a reward for information. But there was no response. Ada remained silent, just as she had been silent in her father's house, just as she had been silent in the face of her exile. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the strongest choice of all. Ada had learned to protect herself through silence, to survive through it, and now she chose to maintain it not out of fear, but out of dignity. She had nothing to prove to her father. His guilt was his to carry, not hers to relieve. 5 years passed. Hope was now a bright, curious child with her mother's thoughtful eyes and a laugh that could light up entire rooms. She attended the small school near Miriam's house, where she excelled in every subject. She helped her mother with the sewing business, her small hands already showing skill with needle and thread. Ada's small operation had grown into something remarkable. She now employed 15 women, all of them survivors of various tragedies, all of them given a second chance through Miriam's and Ada's generosity. They had moved into a larger space, a workshop with proper equipment and good lighting. Ada's designs had caught the attention of merchants in the capital, and orders came from across the region. She had learned business from Miriam, and from her own careful observation, she had learned to negotiate, to manage finances, to plan for growth while maintaining quality. She had learned that strength came not from never falling, but from standing back up every single time. On a bright Saturday morning, Ada loaded Hope into her car, a sleek Porsche SUV that represented everything she had built from nothing. They were going to the city to meet with a new distributor. But first, Ada had decided they would take a small detour. "Where are we going, Mama?" Hope asked. "Somewhere I used to know," Ada said. "Somewhere I need to see one more time." She hadn't planned this trip. She had spent 5 years building a life that had nothing to do with her past. But lately, she had been feeling something pulling at her. A need to close a circle that had been left open, not for her father, not for revenge or vindication, but for herself, to prove to herself that she could stand in that place and feel nothing but peace. The old neighborhood looked smaller than she remembered. The church steeple still reached toward heaven, the compound still bustled with Saturday activity. Ada parked across the street and sat there for a moment, her hands on the steering wheel, her heart surprisingly calm. "Is this where you grew up?" Hope asked. "Yes." "Can we get out?" "In a moment." Then the gate opened, and Grace stepped out. She was heading toward the market, a basket on her arm, when she glanced across the street and froze. The basket fell from her hands, vegetables rolling across the ground forgotten. "Ada," she whispered, though the distance was too great for Ada to hear. Then louder, "Ada!" Grace ran. She ran like she had never run before, across the street, around the car, to the driver's side where Ada was already stepping out. They collided in an embrace that 5 years of separation had done nothing to diminish. "My baby," Grace sobbed. "My precious baby. Where have you been? Are you all right? Is that—" She had spotted Hope, who was watching from the passenger seat with wide, curious eyes. "That's your granddaughter," Ada said quietly. "Her name is Hope." Grace pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Hope climbed out of the car slowly, this confident child suddenly shy in the face of such overwhelming emotion. "Hello?" Hope said politely. "Are you my grandma?" Grace knelt down, not caring about the dust on her skirt. "Yes, sweetheart. Yes, I am." By now, a crowd had gathered. Neighbors poured out of houses. Church members emerged from the compound, all drawn by the commotion. They saw Ada, barely recognizable from the broken girl who had left 5 years ago. She stood tall and strong, dressed in professional clothes, radiating success and dignity. She held her daughter's hand, protective but not afraid. The whispers started immediately, racing through the crowd like electricity. Pastor Daniel heard the noise from inside the church. He came outside, his steps heavy, wondering what could possibly cause such a stir. Then he saw her, his daughter, standing there like a vision, like an answer to 5 years of desperate prayers. He walked toward her slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might make her disappear. The crowd parted for him, silent now, watching this reunion with held breath. Ada watched him approach. She saw how he had aged, how the weight of his guilt had carved lines into his face. She saw the moment he noticed Hope, saw his knees buckle slightly at the realization. He stopped a few feet away, as if an invisible barrier prevented him from coming closer. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Ada." Just her name. Nothing else. As if that one word contained all the apologies, all the regret, all the love he had failed to show when it mattered. "Father," she replied, her tone neutral. "Forgive me." He fell to his knees right there in the dust, before his daughter, before his congregation, before God and everyone. "Please, I failed you. I failed you so completely. I should have listened. I should have protected you. I should have been the father you deserved. I cast you out when I should have held you close. I believed my pride over your pain. I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong. Please, Ada. Please forgive me." The silence stretched. Everyone waited. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The confrontation, 5 years in the making. Would she rage? Would she weep? Would she turn and leave him there, broken in the dust? Ada looked at her father. She thought about all the nights she had spent angry, bitter, broken by his rejection. She thought about the journey that anger had taken her on, how it had nearly destroyed her before she learned to let it go. Forgiveness, she had discovered, was not about letting someone off the hook. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of carrying their sins. She stepped forward and lifted her father gently by the arms, helping him to his feet. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the silent crowd. "I forgave you long ago, Father. I had to, for my own peace, for my daughter's future. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't make the pain disappear or the years return. But it does release me from the burden of your mistakes. I forgive you, not because you've earned it, but because I choose freedom over bitterness." Pastor Daniel's face crumpled, and he wept as he had not wept since the day she left. Grace came to stand beside Ada, creating a small circle of family that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Hope, who had been watching all of this with solemn attention, tugged on Ada's hand. "Mama, are we all fixed now?" Ada looked down at her daughter, at this child who had been born in shame and raised in love, who knew nothing of the darkness that had preceded her arrival. She smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, we're all fixed now." But even as she said it, Ada knew that fixed was perhaps the wrong word. They were not fixed. They were transformed, changed by fire into something new. The cracks remained, the scars remained, but they had found a way to exist alongside them, to build meaning from the ruins. Pastor Daniel reached out tentatively toward Hope. "May I?" Hope looked at her mother, who nodded. The little girl stepped forward and placed her small hand in her grandfather's weathered one. "Are you really a pastor?" Hope asked. "I am. My mama says pastors are supposed to help people who are hurting. Your mama is absolutely right. Then maybe you can help fix all the other people like her. All the other people who got hurt and nobody believed them." From the mouths of children. Pastor Daniel looked at his granddaughter, at this wise young soul, and nodded slowly. "That," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is exactly what I'm going to do." And he meant it. In the months that followed, Pastor Daniel became a different kind of shepherd. He opened the church to survivors, created safe spaces for testimony, brought in counselors and advocates. He publicly acknowledged his failure with Ada, used his own shame as a teaching moment about pride and prejudice and the dangerous certainty of judgment. Some members left the church, unable to reconcile this new humility with the commanding figure they had known. But many stayed, and new people came, drawn by a message of redemption that felt hard-earned and true. Ada didn't stay in the neighborhood. After that day, she returned to her life, to her business, to the world she had built. But she visited, monthly at first, then weekly. Grace came to her workshop, spent time with Hope, slowly rebuilt the bridge that exile had nearly destroyed. Pastor Daniel sent letters, careful words that asked nothing and offered everything. Ada read them all, responded to some, left others unanswered. Healing, she learned, did not follow a straight path or a predictable timeline. Hope grew up knowing all her history. Ada never hid the truth from her. She explained, in age-appropriate ways, what had happened and why. She explained that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us fail, but that failure doesn't define us. She explained that shame is a liar, that survival is courage, that standing back up is the bravest thing anyone can do. The workshop continued to thrive. Ada expanded, opened a second location, then a third. She hired more women, more survivors, more people who needed a second chance. She became known not just for her products, but for her philosophy, that everyone deserves dignity, that work can be healing, that community is medicine. Years passed. Hope graduated top of her class, then went on to university to study social work. "I want to help people like you helped all those women," she told her mother. "I want to be strong like you." "You're already strong," Ada replied. "You were born strong, you just needed time to see it." One evening, many years after that first reunion, Ada stood in her workshop after everyone had gone home. She ran her hands over the fabrics, the machines, the walls that contained so much history and hope. She thought about the girl she had been, terrified and alone, cast out into the storm. She thought about the journey from that broken shed to this thriving business. She thought about all the women who had walked through these doors carrying their own storms, their own secrets, their own desperate need for a second chance. She thought about her father, who called her every Sunday now, who had learned to listen more than he spoke, who had become the kind of pastor who prioritized compassion over certainty. She thought about her mother, who babysat Hope whenever Ada traveled, who had finally found her own voice and used it to advocate for change within the church. She thought about Miriam, who had passed away peacefully 2 years ago, surrounded by the women whose lives she had touched, whose legacy lived on in every stitch they made. And she thought about forgiveness, not as a single moment but as a practice, a daily choice to release resentment and embrace possibility. Forgiveness had not erased her pain, but it had prevented that pain from erasing her future. The storms that had tried to break her had instead become the winds that helped her rise. She had been exiled from one home and built another. She had been cast out of one family and created another. She had been told she carried shame and instead carried hope. She was Ada, survivor, mother, teacher, builder, forgiver, and she was free. In life, the storms that try to break us often become the winds that help us rise. We are tested not to break, but to discover what we're made of when everything else is stripped away. Ada's story reminds us that exile can become a journey, that rejection can become liberation, that the very thing meant to destroy us can become the foundation of our greatest strength. But here's the question that matters. What would you have done in Ada's place? When your father cast you out, when the truth was too painful to speak, when the world turned its back and you had nothing but your dignity and your unborn child, what would you have chosen? Would you have returned in victory, offering forgiveness to the man who failed you? Or would you have walked away forever, building your new life without looking back? There's no single right answer. Every survivor's journey is their own. Every path to healing is unique. But the conversation matters. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Tell us in the comments below. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own storms or your own rising, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We share stories like this every week, stories of resilience and transformation, stories that honor the human capacity to survive and thrive against impossible odds. Don't miss the next one. Until then, remember, you are stronger than the storms that seek to break you, and your rising is already written in the winds.